And good evening. It's Al here. I am joined by Jim McMurtry, who has quite an interesting story. He's a victim of, I want to say woke culture, but yeah, I guess woke culture would be a good word. And it's all to do with a Canadian issue. I know not all my viewers are Canadian. We will bring you up to speed on the situation. I heard something. Oh, so in Canada, we have these things. We had these schools starting in 1889 and going till uh, they shut down mostly in the 60s and 70s. There was a few that strayed into the 90s, and they were called Indian residential schools. They were schools that some of the Indigenous people went to. Not all of them went to residential schools. And they're spoken about very negatively. I'm not going to go into how bad they were or how good they were or how whatever. We're not getting into that now. But in 2008, Stephen Harper, who was the prime minister at the time, he called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to talk about residential schools and the crimes committed in them, what was their intent, all that stuff. And in 2015, there was the final report of the residential school. And the big word thrown around was cultural genocide. That was the big word. And then they had 95 calls to action. So it's not just apologize and compensate the victims. We needed to do 95 calls to action. Okay. And this kind of faded into oblivion as time passed on. Then in 2020, we have COVID and everyone's at home, laid off from work. And in May of 2021, the world hears about this news coming out of Kamloops that they had found a mass grave just by the residential school, obviously pointing the finger at the residential school, saying whoever's in that grave is there because of that school. And that's where my friend Jim McMurtry comes in. He has this is what connects to his story. So I think I gave a pretty good summary. Is there anything you want to add up until then, Jim?
Well, there's a lot of things that I'd like to say because it's affected me so greatly. But I think you did a super job, Al, and I know you know this issue as well as I, if not better. And my story is, and I should like to say, first of all, I have an academic background, a PhD from the University of Toronto. For my master's, I worked under a man named Dr. Robert Carney, who was in many people's eyes at the time, the leading expert on residential schools. So I do have training. I have had many publications in the area, and I've taught many Indigenous children. So I'm not somebody who's new to what they used to call Indian education policy. And I think there's an awful lot of there's apocryphal, there's a lot that's false, it's mythical about these schools. They're being presented as hellholes, as houses of horror, and yet very obviously they were an important alternative to no education whatsoever for our Indigenous or Native people. Just one thing that I quickly mentioned that it was hard. You mentioned that these schools began in the 1980s officially, though there were schools that were similar to them, industrial schools and so forth, prior to that. But the 1880s is interesting because there's a lot of starvation. The buffalo were disappearing from the Western Plains. And it was a really difficult time for First Nations in particular, not just Inuit and Métis and others, but for the First Nations in the West and North where many of these schools were. So the schools were seen not just to be an opportunity, a way of giving kids an education they didn't have, but also a leg up on entering the 20th century and surviving. So the intentions were noble in my view, and things weren't perfect in the schools, is true in other schools as well, and maybe in some ways worse than for other schools. But that's moot. What matters to me is there was an allegation when I was teaching on May 31st, 2021, 2.5 years ago, and news had broken that 215 children had been murdered in one school, not far from where I was teaching. And I thought, based on,
So pause for a second. They actually said that these kids were murdered.
well, I think all the media did. I think that was certainly the. Now, whether people are using the word media or simply mass graves and leaving it up to people's imaginations, but I mean, it's interesting you say that, Al, because I'm gonna address that in what the written allegation was against me. But what I find fascinating is, so there I was, a substitute teacher in math at a school where I was substituting, and all the teachers were told we had to speak about was something that was, again, became international news about the remains of 215 children were discovered in an apple orchard on a reserve in Kamloops, British Columbia, which is,
and right next to a school, right?
that's right. That's right. Right next to the residential school called Kamloops Indian Residential School, and also not far from where there was a sanatorium for people with tuberculosis, and right opposite, right on the other side of the river, Thompson River, from the city of Kamloops. And again, the school at the heart of the reserve. So the idea that 215 kids could be murdered or clandestinely buried, and nobody would know about it for decades, and all of a sudden someone would say, "Oh, look what I found." So the whole story is, in my view, and I'm going to sound hard here, it's nothing other than fake news. It could be much harder than say a hoax, but I think the Indigenous people weren't the ones responsible really for this. It was one person who was using ground penetrating radar who identified, which most of us believe to be an old sewage trench, and said, "Oh, these must be graves." And because they were shallow, they must be child graves, because you don't have to dig as deep apparently for children. And well, anyhow, there's all sorts of suppositions. But you see, this goes back, Al, a long time, because there have been many ghost stories, many rumors about Europeans long ago being really brutal toward Indigenous people in Canada and the United States, even more so. And I think there's some truth to that. Obviously there was conflict, but I think the bigger part of the story is that early settlers and early Canadian governments worked hard to try and help Indigenous people, and the Oblate priests and brothers and the nuns from the Sisters of St. Anne who taught in that school are dead now. But if they were here with us, they'd be not only shocked, but terribly dismayed to hear that they apparently murdered or in some way or another caused unnaturally the death of 215 children. And so all I said in school that day, and I didn't do well because I haven't taught since, and I will likely never teach again. Wow. Because I was fired, and I've been told by both my regulatory body, which wants to suspend me for life, and by my employer that they will never have me back. And if I don't get hired back in Abbotsford and with this black mark, then I know I'm not going to get work anymore. Anyhow, so all I said was that my understanding, as an informed person in the area of history, was that the children did die at this school. There were 51, and they died mostly from disease, particularly tuberculosis. So that's all it was. Within about an hour of saying that, two vice principals came up to my room and asked me to get my stuff. And I didn't want to create a scene in front of students, so I cooperated, and I walked out, and they wanted me to walk out of the school, and I started to get angry because they weren't answering me. And I said, "I'm going to make this hard for you if you don't allow me to speak to the principal." And the principal had really, it was really quite interesting because I insisted on telling the principal what I had said. I said, I don't believe I said anything wrong. And he didn't think I'd say anything wrong as well. It was just the fact that I was a white male that nobody knew at the school and saying something that was counter to what other people were saying, which was murder and torture. I had a number of students in my class saying, "Oh no, it was genocide," and all those sort of things. And I countered that by saying disease. But I don't think I was in any way unfaithful to the historical record or to Indigenous people. I thought my tone was professional, but I'm being told now that my tone was, without anyone knowing, because nobody else was in the classroom with me but the students, that my tone was somehow insensitive, inflammatory, and inappropriate. The reality is that we live in a society where if you're not a conformist in this whole new agenda, as you know, relating to gender, race, indigenization, lowering of standards, equity marking, censorship of literature, the replacement with social justice, trite claptrap, in my view, historical falsification. I could go on. There's an agenda. I'll call it from the left. I'll call it from people, and maybe in the beginning, some of them were do-gooders, but they have this idea that Canada is this horrible racist country, and we did nothing but harmful things to Indigenous people, and we have to atone for that today. Now, quite apart from that, I simply, as a history teacher, and I wasn't that day a history teacher, but I was asked to be by the principal, I felt that it was obligated to tell the truth. And the truth is and remains no graves, not only no mass grave, no graves,
zero graves.
No parent, Al, ever saying that his or her child was missing in any residential school over 150 years and 150 such schools. The whole thing is apocryphal. The whole thing is fictional. And yet Canada jumped on this. And you know, we talked before a little bit earlier today, and you're very wise on this. But the ramifications from this discovery led to Canada adopting UNDRIP and Canada declaring itself having committed genocide alongside of Nazi Germany and Cambodia and Soviet Union and so on, and all sorts of money being given.
And the Pope coming over. That's what caused Pope Francis to come.
And they forced him in the airplane on his return to use the word genocide. They goaded him for the entirety of his stay to say genocide. For some reason, Trudeau, the Liberal government, wants to stain our country with the most serious crime of all. And yet there's no evidence of any crime. There's only one priest that was ever convicted of any crime, and it certainly wasn't murder, and it was something to do with, abusing a child, but only one. So I think that's probably a better record than most schools in most places. And I mean, one priest in all these residential schools across Canada over 150 years. So it's a highly inflated problem. That obviously, of course, there were things that went wrong, and we've learned as a society how to better educate and culturally respect and not to take children at too young an age, away from their parents and so forth. But again, most of these kids at these residential schools, they could have gone to a day school. They could have gone to a public school. Their parents had to sign an application for them to go. In most cases, some cases, there were orphans and kids that weren't receiving any food and were being abused in the home and had to go there. They operated as a bit of a welfare system.
Well, do you know something? I found an article from a local newspaper somewhere in southern Saskatchewan where it talks about how the government wanted to shut down one of the this is like 1970, 71. They wanted to shut down the residential schools, and a bunch of Indian chiefs are like, no, leave the school. It helps our community and stuff like that.
Well, the reason you're saying that is because, like me, the two of us are educated. We believe that there's value in education. And why would
in critical thought more than anything,
and too. But I think there's no Indigenous parent back then or today who's saying, no, I don't want my kid in a receiving a Western education. a modern education based on Enlightenment values and academic principles long established, such as, obviously development and many different senses, physically, socially, mentally, intellectually, on and on and on. I just don't think the alternative, which is not being in a school, is desirable. So of course they won kids in our schools back then and today. And I don't think I've heard a single sensible argument as to why these residential schools shouldn't have happened. The reason they had some schools that were residential, but most of them were still within a reserve, but not all kids could have a school where they were. Some bands had 50 people. They're nomadic. They were traveling, following whether it was buffalo or caribou or just wherever berries were. The reality is you had to take some kids from small isolated communities and bring them to where they could put together a school. And the Kamloops school, which people like to say is, again, a house of horrors, it had a huge swimming pool. It had reunions, grad events, dances, music bands, sports teams, international trips. It had so many things that many other schools didn't have. I just think it's awful, and that we have this tendency to see the world as black and white and say all early Europeans, and particularly Christians. I feel in schools there's a war on Christians, particularly Catholics, Al, because the Catholics ran the majority of their schools. They didn't run all their schools. So there's an assumption here that there's something wrong with early Canadian Catholic teachers. And all I can say to you, I've met some of them. I'm old enough to have met some of them. And and I have 4 missionaries in my own family, 2 great uncles, a great grandfather, and a great great grandfather. And I just wonderful, wonderful men. And I have learned so much about the Catholic teachers, beginning, of course, the very beginning of the formation of Canada with the Ursulines and the Jesuits and so forth. Canada was founded, yes, by Brits and French and First Nations, and others came together. But I think if you had to identify one group who did the most important things of all, the hospitals, the schools, creating hygiene and civility, I think we owe so much to early Catholics in this country, and to see them being stained as and referred to as genocidal maniacs who had no good intentions with these young, vulnerable children.
Yeah, no, that's like I think that's absolute an abomination. And the fact that our prelates, the Catholic bishops, aren't standing up for this, well, I guess a lot of them don't know. They haven't done the research like we have, and I don't know. I think it's easier if they put their head down and say, as you say, conformist. Be a conformist. Don't inquire. It's kind of like 1984. I'm sure you've read that book. Or and see a thing. The thing is, I told you this over the phone when we talked. I try to make a point in all my research. I I go online and I search it. The first attack on these residential schools started in 1986. That's when the United Church apologized. Then a few more churches apologized in the subsequent years. Then in the 90s, it picks up. In the 2000s, then you have the commission report that for some reason took 7 years. I don't know why. And then of course the propaganda, the mass graves, which I'm calling a fake mass grave. If they want to prove me wrong in Kamloops, dig up those spots. That's all you need to do to prove me wrong, and then I'll admit I'm wrong, and so will Jim, I assume. But so the point is, each time I try to do the research, I use books written before 1986. Because facts are always the same. But the cultural climate's a bit different. So in my books, or in my research, I only use pre 1986. Like a book that I picked up, it's I know a lot of the missionaries were French. This is an Italian one. He left his memoirs. It's over there. But like this guy taught in the early 1900s, and yeah, the point is, like, I'm trying to do the research before the narrative came. Because think, for example, the United States, from the founding first settlers there until Abraham Lincoln, had slavery, right? And there were people that opposed it. Yes, a lot said it was a good thing. The vast majority of the people just went with the flow, but there were pamphleteers who wrote against slavery, saying it was bad. So technically, if all this cultural genocide has happened, people should have been opposing it from the 1880s to 1986, right? On paper, it should have happened. The most I have found is when a doctor visited 10 or 20 of the schools. He said they were underfunded. Okay, well, that's not killing the Indian and the child. That's, you know, you don't have enough funds for the schools. That has nothing to do with the intent, right?
Well, you make so many comments, and I don't really know where to jump in. But if I may start in saying that there was a former prime minister. This is, I know you have some non-Canadians in your large audience, but the former prime minister by the name of Jean Chrétien, who's still alive, and really an interesting guy, because he's part of his reputation is that very candid. So he's a bit of a tough talker. And one thing that he said when he was interviewed a few years back is that he was justice minister and minister of Indian Affairs around the time, of course, there were still a number of residential schools. And he said he didn't hear any criticisms. He didn't hear any tales of abuse.
Wow.
And then he rose to prime minister, and he was there in that job, I believe, for 10 years. It's not something that was part of anyone's experience in the 60s and the 70s. This, I think you're right on, it started in the 80s. I think what happens, and I use just psychology as an example. If I want to feel like I'm good in anything, I will work hard. Let's say I become a teacher of a grade 2 class next year, and I tell the kids at the beginning how terrible the teacher was the year before, and on and on and on, then there's a better chance probably that I'm not going to seem so bad to them, because they don't really know what that previous teacher was like. They just have me, and I'm telling them how bad the others were and how wonderful I am. I think that's what virtue signaling is. I think this is a game for the president, the current government, not just in Canada. I think Joe Biden does this too. The Western leaders who love to say how much better they are than others, how much more moral, and then they work and they go after and say to certain groups, you were victimized, you were terribly treated, and I'm going to treat you differently. Now, the problem with that, among many problems, is that by making people feel that they were victims, then they're not going to have much allegiance to the country. So I think woke politics become incredibly divisive. It's not only historical falsification. I think it's socially very dangerous to be telling minorities within your country how terribly they were treated in the past, and to always demonize white European Canadians. And to do that with kids, telling kids that because you're white, even though you might live in a trailer park or your parents are struggling, you're privileged and you're oppressors and you're microaggressors and you're just generally bad people because of the pigment of your skin. Like, it's just the schools have become more about indoctrination and education. So with me, and the one thing that I have managed to do, I think, that I have attracted a little bit of a following. I've got about 10,000 on Twitter. And the reason that's happened is that I'm a little different, that I stood my ground, and I've been hurt for that, but I'm not bending. that I refuse to lie to kids about anything. That boys and girls are boys and girls. They're not part of 86 genders. That people shouldn't be judged on.
Ooh, you radical.
Yeah, people shouldn't be judged on the color of their skin, but the content of their character, as Martin Luther King said. Anyway, I could go on. So, and that literature is of value. We're censoring Seuss and Roald Dahl and so many classics, Kill a Mockingbird and so forth, because these woke moralists say, oh, there's this one bad word, therefore you got to throw it out. And they replace great literature with contrived, social justice narratives I mentioned at the beginning, that present, and again, the black and white Manichaean worldview of white people, particularly Christian males, are the evil characters, and everybody else is being victimized. I think that's very dangerous. I think what we need to do as a society is have nice things to say to each other, and to try and get at the truth, not just in the past and the present. And the truth is that for free, early Canadians worked hard to provide an education, housing, hospitalization, and many other services for people who weren't contributing to the public coffers. I think that needs to be part of the narrative. Yes, I'm sure we didn't do the best possible job, but to say that our ancestors were monsters is to me criminal. And so I'm willing to be that teacher who is not going to, as said, back down to the woke mob. So they've not only, as said earlier, they've taken away my job, they're wanting to take away my license for life. It doesn't matter, because in the end, I'm going to, in some way, come out on top, because I think that the truth, goodness, beauty do prevail. Amen. I really do. And in this particular case, the early Christian teachers at these schools, Al, need to be presented as they were. And in most cases, they came all the way from Europe for very little pay to do something that was going to define their lives. And that was to help some of the neediest groupings in the world. That's how they saw their job, not to liquidate students, but to obviously care for them.
Yeah, no, it's certainly true that like there's priests there that gave their entire career. They could have had a nice parish in a suburb of Toronto or Quebec or Calgary or what, but no, they chose to go and in the like a lot of these schools are in very remote locations, so go to remote locations and help some of the most marginalized people in the world. And and like it's being taught as like a project of genocide, which is absolutely ridiculous. Because like I remember they got Pope Francis to say, he's like, oh, maybe it was a genocide. And of course those airplane interviews are kind of like the new ex cathedra statements. They're the most important things the Pope ever says these days. And now there seems to be a lack of critical thought when it comes to this stuff. Like, okay, they confronted you. You said the most people died of natural causes. Some people say they were killed intentionally. Let's discuss. Let's weigh the evidence. No. It's boom. You're gone. You're not towing the line.
But can I?
Yeah.
If there's any impression I'd like to leave you and your viewers with, is that I think you've listened to me for the last little while, 20 minutes, whatever. I don't think I come across as somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about, as a bad person. I contributed over 40 years to teaching. I was made a principal for a short time. I always volunteered, coaching, theater, charitable events. I have a passion for teaching, and I've always felt that I did my best for the young people who are in my charge. The fact that I'm being completely run out of the profession for insisting on historical honesty and accuracy says a lot about our society in this day and age.
Yeah, no, like our education system is obviously in the trash. I just want to follow up on something you mentioned earlier. When did Chrétien say that? He said he heard no complaints when he was the justice minister.
Oh gosh, I think we're probably looking back about 3 years ago.
Okay. So it's not like back in the 90s or
No, when he was in office, this was never an issue. Isn't that an extraordinary thing? Except it came up toward the end of his term in office, but it was a very minor thing. It's really extraordinary. But some of the rumors that came out of Kamloops again, where this big story began, the monumental story that went around the world. That one story was in 1964, Queen Elizabeth and her husband, Prince Philip, visited the school, and they kidnapped 10 children, and those 10 children were never seen again. That's been around for a long time. That's something you can find on the internet. Now,
wow.
It turns out Queen Elizabeth, who had been watched, it's pretty hard for her to steal 10 kids.
The media following her around.
But it's what's interesting here. She never visited Kamloops, and so yeah. So, but it doesn't matter what so what you've got a conflation here of rumors of things from the past, of people wanting to say bad things, and the reality is that's not new. I think one hears bad things about pretty much anybody. Mother Teresa, there's a lot of people out there in the world who would say bad things about Mother Teresa, and yet, my gosh, she lived a saintly life. But what I just don't understand now is why my employer and my professional regulator, and to some extent my union, and some members of my union are supportive, but most aren't. Why is it more important to them that they're seen to be saviors, seen to be these wonderful rescuers of this betrothed and forgotten people who were sent and brutalized at these schools, far from their families long ago? Why is that narrative more important to them than in having a discussion with me and trying to get a sense of what really happened? Nobody's had a discussion with me. Now, a couple of people have begun it, and then they just quickly close it down because they recognize they're talking with somebody who brings out evidence. There's no evidence that in Kamloops, other than a school that really worked very hard. The parents in Native community love many of the principals. Many of the staff, Jim, Al, many of the staff were caretakers, cooks, and cleaners and so forth were Indigenous at the school at the time. It was right people, many of the kids didn't even stay overnight because it was right in their community. It was the ones that came from other bands that were farther away and were too small to have their own place. This idea that any of this is true is just so preposterous. And yet you've got half of Canada lining up on one side of this. You said earlier the Catholic Church has been rather quiet about this. I have a different take, and I'm speaking as someone who comes from a Christian background, and so I'm not in any way. I'm the opposite. I'm a very proud Christian, but what's interesting to me here is I think the Catholic Church in Canada, because I've written to all sorts of people, the Catholic Church is afraid of its half of its own congregation, just in the same way that I'm afraid of half of my teaching staff at the school I was last in, because they are of a persuasion where they want to believe all this. They want to just believe that anybody who says anything positive about teachers back in time in these schools, or anybody says something positive about Derek Chauvin and or police officers during the George Floyd incident, or somebody who, whatever, there's just this assumption that these people, that someone like me, have to be a denialist, like people denied the Holocaust, have to be racist, bigoted, just malicious, ignorant, all these things. And I'm going, oh my gosh, if someone ever had a different view than I would never label them in all these horrible ways. I would start by saying, well, tell me more, and what evidence do you have? But I just think it's so extraordinary that in schools and also in Catholic circles, which I know well, that people are afraid to even have any discourse, because you're so worried about offending the half of the congregation, the half of the classroom, the half of the staff, the half of whatever.
That's woke.
Thank you.
Oh, do you have anything else, or?
I don't want. I know I have a tendency to talk too much because I lost my livelihood over this. I've said a lot, but if this is toward the end, Al, and I don't know if you have any more questions for me, I'm happy to spend more time, but I just want the viewers again and to look at me and see me in one way, and that is I'm a teacher. And by listening to me, you're allowing me still to teach. You're giving me a voice. So I'm very appreciative to you, Al. I'm very appreciative to anybody who listens, because I think the job of a teacher more than anything else is to have open inquiry with students, to understand contentious, difficult matters, to see them from a different number of different perspectives, to walk a little distance in their shoes, and most importantly, to come away with their own interpretation, with their own conclusions. My job isn't to have anyone in your viewership, anyone that I teach, anyone anywhere thinking like I do. I just want them to be thinking better. And so the idea that my employer is completely resistant to ever talking to me, completely resistant to the educational idea that our job is to understand things better and to think better. They're so caught in this rut that nothing is more important for their own career promotion than to push this dystopic, dark ideology where it just blames Western civilization and Christians and white people and so forth for all mankind's ills. Mm-hmm. I just think it's so wrong. And even if that were true, I still think students should be able to come to their own conclusion.
Okay, I got a question. Like, back in when did you officially get fired? In May of
May 2021, 2.5 years ago.
That was when like the whole mass grave stuff was fresh in headlines.
It came out. Al, can I just say it came out that day that I was teaching. Again, I was a substitute teacher at a new school. Came out. Some kids even had orange paint on. They were orange from head to toe. They had armbands and shirts, and it was just this. It was an hysteria. Kids were apoplectic or indignant with rage toward anyone who was like me, a white male, older, who said at the beginning of the discussion, I don't want to cast any aspersions against any of the churches because I don't think that's our purpose today. And they just, wow, it was unbelievable. There was no possibility of reasoned discussion with anyone that at that school that day, because the goal of the superintendent and others in the district was to let kids. It was like you mentioned 1984. It was like the 2-minute hate that they did, that for to love Big Brother and of course to hate Eurasia or East Asia or whoever had to be hated. They worked the kids up into that kind of mania, frenzy, into that hatred. So yes, I was my timing was bad.
So then, yeah, okay. So that's when, like on the day and the next month, and that summer even, that's when the mass grave narrative was at its peak. But now 2 years have passed. They quietly demoted it to from mass graves to unmarked graves to potential unmarked graves. Like they're slowly demoting it, and now people are saying, "Look, you've had 2 years. How come you haven't dug up the bodies?" So the narrative, although there's still a lot of pro narrative, a few people are kind of getting more lukewarm about it. Has that affected your situation at all?
Okay, you asked so many great
Oh,
questions, and I'm very appreciative of you. Um, I haven't taught for since that happened. The day the news really broke and school was on, it might have broken on a Friday, but it was May 31st, 2021, where everybody knew about it and it was all over the place. So that was my time. I wasn't officially fired for another 2 years, but they were just building their case during that time. And oddly enough, my employer and my regulatory body, here in British Columbia, I don't think are any less woke, any less committed to the idea that Christian teachers in residential schools were monsters. I think they're just creating new stories and fabricating new evidence. They've done 14 digs at different residential schools. Of course, they haven't found anything, but I don't think that's going to slow them down. I think they're just doubling down. I don't think they can be exposed because their whole game, everything that they represent is wrong. We talked about, again, the censorship, the gender, the racial categorization, the lowering of standards, the scholarships to non-whites, their whole program is educationally wrong. And particularly the basic overarching desire to indoctrinate children, to manipulate them, and even talking about sexuality to kindergarten kids. And so it's a house of cards is going to collapse. The sad thing for me is it's cost me, again, my livelihood, but I think it's already changing. Yes, as I said, those people they drank the Kool-Aid and they're still infected, but they're intoxicated. But I think more of the people who didn't know much about history, didn't care, people on the sidelines, people that sort of went along with the crowd. I think more and more people are going, well, why is there no evidence? And maybe, just maybe, this is another lie, because we've had some lies recently. And I'll use COVID as an example. When I went with my grandchildren and I couldn't go, there'd be nobody around, there'd be a huge park and there'd be tape and I couldn't go into a park all by ourselves. And the water fountains were turned off. And it was just this crazy fanaticism. And I think we've seen it before, like during the McCarthy years. We're seeing it in Russia today, where all the people are gung-ho about killing Ukrainians. It doesn't take much for some people to be caught up in a cause. And we saw it with the Hamas massacre in Israel. And all I'm saying is that that I am proud of myself because I'm doing the one thing that people like you are going to, if you remember him at all, it will be for this: that teachers can't lie to students. You have to do your best. It's too important a responsibility. So even though nobody's giving in, I'm telling you, my even a lot of people in my own union, but certainly my regulatory and my employer, they are no less nasty to me now. They want me, they would, I don't know to what extent they would go to make me disappear. And
Wow.
only because they know that they're wrong and I'm right. And I said that the moment they walked me out, I said that eventually the truth, which always has this tendency, will reveal itself.
And yeah, no, a lot of people, and it's not like it's a matter of cash, because that summer the Canadian government gave to the Indigenous communities over $300 million to investigate these things. So it's not like we don't have any cash. That's not a valid excuse. Do you think if they do you think they're going to take up Kamloops in the near future?
No, I am smiling right now because there's something I just remembered that,
Oh,
that you're
sure.
going to appreciate you're saying. No, it's about the digging.
Okay.
And for your viewers to know, do you know that I called the RCMP recently and I said to them, the biggest mass murder of children and probably and maybe in North American history, it's certainly in Canadian history, took place not very long ago and right in your community, talking to the police in Kamloops, and you haven't even investigated. And that person at the other end was going, well, we gave over the responsibility to the First Nation. Oh, okay. So you have it. So someone says 215 kids are murdered, and you're not going to do your job and investigate. You're going to say, oh, well, I'm going to leave it over to the people in that neighborhood. And it's just the most corrupt thing imaginable. So it's not just that nobody's digging, nobody's investigating. And then Trudeau comes out. He comes out and makes this big display about it because everybody before him is so terrible. And then look at him. He's this wonderful savior prime minister. He comes out and he puts it and he goes into a grave site, an actual grave site in a different part of Canada. And he kneels down with a teddy bear and he puts his head down. And, this whole idea, another one of the killing fields. It's just theater. And yet, what does this do to Indigenous people? Not only to distract us from real problems on their reserves, where we'd like to be helping them. There's problems with fetal alcohol syndrome, with water that's in some cases impure, with family abuse, drugs, anyhow, all there are problems. And so instead of helping them, we're going back in time and changing history. So yes, you asked the most important question. If you're going to pass a blood libel against earnest Catholic teachers from 50 years ago or 150 years ago, if you're going to do that, you need to have some proof. And the idea of not digging, they even said they're children because they're shallow graves. They're only 2 or 3 feet under the surface, which makes no sense because the animals would have dug them up if there were bodies there. But that's why we put them down 6 feet typically. And so, yeah, they have no intention. They will never dig in Kamloops. And yet Jim McMurtry, me, will never likely teach again.
Yeah, because like Kamloops, they boldly proclaimed it a mass grave. I don't know who did that. If it was Roseanne Casimir herself who did that, did she say it was a mass grave?
Yes. There's a document that the assembly, not just Roseanne Casimir, the chief, but all the chiefs in Canada together in the organization, pan-Canadian, called the Assembly of First Nations, passed a motion within a month, in early July. I believe the dates were July 6th to 9th. They passed a motion talking about mass graves in Kamloops, the discovery of a mass grave in Kamloops. And so this is corruption. that began, in my view, with our government, that quickly was picked up by woke media, and was laterally, but within fairly short time afterwards, by Indigenous people feeling there was an opportunity to get more money from taxpayers.
Gravy train, yep.
Yeah, and that's a gravy train that recently there have been announcements of 63 billion for this and 25 billion for that. So it's not the hundreds of millions, it's in the billions. And soon we might be one day talking about trillions. So it's a big transfer of wealth in Canada based on, and again, 1984, based on people who are clever enough to know that those who control the past control the present, and those who control the present control the future. So I think it's a scandal, and yet you're not going to hear anyone in media. You're not going to hear anybody in government. You're not going to hear anyone in the Indigenous community come out and say that, because they all have vested interests, particularly those that don't want to come out and say, like in the media, who don't have much to lose, but they're not going to come out and say, we got it all wrong. People don't do that. They should.
Well, the thing is, I think that Kamloops with, mass grave on the front page of the New York Times and tons of other major newspapers around the globe, like this was global news, that I think if they dig up Kamloops, that's the flagship of the reconciliation movement, the Kamloops mass grave. And if that gets sunk, it's going to be a big blow to the reconciliation movement. Do you want to comment on that, or?
Well, you're absolutely right. That's why they're not going to dig.
Because I think deep down they know they overplayed their hand.
Well, no, it all collapses. It all collapses. Not only are they never going to find bodies anywhere else, but again, they've looked in 14 different places, and the media have gone on about all these Aboriginal knowings about murder. And, just one thing that neither of us has mentioned, when the New York Times and Washington Post, I know people from India who live near me in Surrey, British Columbia, but who were back in India, were reading about this in India. It traveled the whole world, this story about Canada being a genocidal state and doing this to Indigenous people. Part of the story was that there were kids as young as 3. Well, kids didn't start the residential schools till 7. That there were 6-year-olds, and they weren't 6-year-olds there either, but 6-year-olds are woken up in the middle of the night to dig the graves. Like it's just so over the top. There was one residential school where there's an electric chair, another one where kids were put in incinerators, another one where kids were hanged, kids impregnated, little kids being abortions, and the babies being, or whatever, fetuses being thrown in fires. It just goes on and on and on. It's a remarkable tendency, and it's something that I teach students, that you need to have humility. Al, if you presented to me at any time in our interview evidence that suggested that anything that I've said to you is wrong, I would sit and I would consider what you would have to say, and I would presumably change my point of view, my opinion. But they're not doing that.
Yeah, the thing is, like me, I don't think there's any kids buried in Kamloops in like along the orchard. You think that too. All you would need for us to admit we're wrong, just dig them up, show us the bodies. We'll admit we're wrong. And for the electric chair, I got to say something. All you would need, apparently there is over 10,000 pages of documents to do with the administration of that school. That's St. Anne's in Ontario somewhere. All they would need to do is just have a line from a priest or a nun or someone who worked there saying, young boy so-and-so was being a jerk in class today, so we threw him on the electric chair for a bit. That's all I would need. Not testimony 50 years later. Because as you know, the electric chair, they can't even get the color of the electric chair right. The multiple testimony. Yeah, it's not a big standard of evidence, show us. Oh, we threw them on the electric chair. Oh,
Yeah.
here's the skeletons of the
And
people
this is
buried.
probably, I know I've talked too much, and if I may just leave you with this point, unless you have another question for me, and that is the Kamloops story began before the mass grave. I told you about 1964, the Queen, stealing kids and so forth. So one of the things that happened not so long ago, but before, about 10 years ago, I could be off, but sometime in the preceding decade, in Kamloops, they found two things. They found a juvenile child tooth and a juvenile rib bone. And that was proof of murder at the school. Well, it turns out that the tooth, they looked in, and it turns out, forensic study, that it was of an animal.
Whoops.
And then the rib bone, they can't find it anymore. but these rumors began long ago. And I think this reminds you of rumors about the Jews. Long before Hitler got in power, there were rumors about Jews and their the blood libel against them. In other words, it's very dangerous to allow these untested rumors to circulate in a society over centuries or decades, because all it's going to take is one person who is, I think, dishonest enough to exploit that.
It happened. It happened in the summer of 2021. The countless churches burned in Alberta and BC, and this right after the mass grave announcement. And then Trudeau, it took him a press conference. He had to be directly asked at a press conference because he wasn't saying anything. Now that this thing's going on in Israel, apparently someone tried to firebomb a synagogue in Montreal. They attempted, they failed, and he spoke out against that, which he should. But when countless churches were torched, he didn't say anything, and he allowed that to happen because of the stupid, the fake mass grave lie.
He did at one point say something, but not at first, because I believe, Al, because this was his famous line. So he didn't, and he only spoke once, in my view. He said, it was wrong to burn churches. And then he said, and tell me if I got this wrong, he said, but he can understand.
Yeah, that's what he said, yeah.
You can understand. And you go, wow, that's an interesting thing. Because I don't think he'd say that, well, this white person burned down a mosque or burned down a synagogue, but I can understand.
Yeah, in fact, I said that at the time. Like, if this was a synagogue, countless synagogues and mosques being torched, you can bet your bottom dollar that he wouldn't be silent about it and had to be asked in a press conference. I just got another thing for you. You talked on the phone today about Orange Shirt Day, how that story itself has dubious origins. Do you want to share some of that?
Yes, the one of the things that's not true about it is the orange shirt itself, whether it actually was taken away, because the person who is spreading the story right now has said recently that she saw other students wearing it. The persons that she said took it away from her were Catholic nuns. She was not ever at a Catholic residential school. She was 1 year at an Anglican day school, if I've got that right. Anyhow, I will stop there because I could go on. The story is fictional. And if any child ever had a shirt taken, because many would have, it was because the children were so poor at the residential schools that when they come back after a long summer holiday, when they're off on looking at trap lines or on hunting with parents and community members, when they come back, they are often in the same clothes that they left in June. So the first
Mhm.
thing they did is they probably burned the clothes and cut the kids' hair because of the lice and so forth, and gave them fresh clothing. The intention was never bad. The as you know, nuns and priests don't have their own children. So for many of them, and they've written about this, the children at those schools were their children. And that beautiful story about Mr. Chips, when the English schoolmaster in all boys school in England, who was so wonderful with all his students, when he was dying, somebody said in his hospital room, "It's too bad that Mr. Chips never had any children of his own." And the dying teacher lifted up his head and he said, "What do you mean I didn't have any children of my own?" And he started to list the names of all the children he'd taught. So I think people need to give them their heads a shake. Teachers now and then don't go into the profession to murder kids. They do it because they feel they can help children. And in some cases, it's more than that. In some cases, it's complete devotion. And that's what I think was the case with most Catholic nuns and priests and brothers.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for agreeing to come on with me. Yeah, no, I thought this was a great conversation. You mentioned a lot of stuff I didn't know. I've been taking notes this whole time, if you haven't noticed. But no, it's good stuff, And so, like, the average person who's just who the only thing they know about this is what they get from the media and schools. What should they do? Is there a book, a website? Should they contact you on Twitter or what?
Well, you know what you said earlier about reading older historians. I do that. Francis Parkman is the one that I like best. Parkman as it sounds, but I think parents, grandparents, neighbors, it doesn't matter what relationship one has to children or to the community. I think we all have to feel a responsibility for seeing that our schools are developing children and readying them for the outer world that they're going to enter. We shouldn't be filling their heads with lies, and we shouldn't be taking them away from the skills and the knowledge that they need to have. And so it's incumbent on all of us to do something. And when they hear about things at school, when they're bringing in drag queens to read to kindergarten children, or telling, again, kids to sit in different parts of the classroom based on their skin color, or telling me when I was an Abbotsford teacher that I couldn't read Agatha Christie, because she was racist, when of course she was an incredible woman, one of the most read authors, if not the most read author ever. So it's just absolutely absurd that too many of us are standing by and allowing these people to do what they're doing, which is trying to capture ideologically the whole society. And the moment you get people like me sticking their head up, they're very quick to, whack-a-mole, right? They're really quick to knock me down. But they're going to find the longer this goes that there's too many of us. And then they're going to be quickly going, "Oh, I never said that. Oh, I agree with you." They're gonna change the tune, because there is absolutely nothing intelligent about any of the woke program as it pertains to schools or our institutions, unless people want to return to communism and one of the ugliest dystopias in human history.
Amen. Yeah, no, and like I said, if anyone wants to prove Jim or me wrong, just dig there, show us the skeleton, and we'll admit we're wrong. Show us. It's not hard. That's not hard to do. You can do that in one evening. Ugh. But they know that if their lie gets exposed, they're in big trouble. The gravy train comes to an end.
It's not a small gravy train. This is a significant. They're talking about land back. They're talking about having all of Canada back and having everybody else rent. We're talking about reinventing feudalism and making everybody who doesn't have a speck of Indigenous blood has that blood quantum, is going to be a serf and working for these idle nobles.
Wow.
And yet the people, in my view, who contribute the most to our society, have contributed most in society, are the very people they're wanting to punish. And that is the churches in particular, because the churches were the ones that came out, that interacted, that learned native languages, that did the hard slogging, that helped bring them into modernity, and in many cases lost their lives doing it. I think they were remarkable people, and not just people like Brébeuf and Lallemont. There's scores of remarkable men and women, and to remember them as genocidal perpetrators is outrageous. And yet, of course, any of the things I've said to you tonight, if my employer, many in my union, and my regulatory body, if any of them had heard any of what I was saying, they'd be writing it down, going, he's digging his grave even deeper, because you can't say anything you can't go anywhere near this. It's just absolutely shocking. They will tear you to pieces. If you are, I have 3 kids who are lawyers, and they can't say a darn thing about any of this. Their partners are lawyers, they can't say anything. All professions. People are just afraid to say anything that's not woke, because they could be reported on. In 1984, children reported on their own parents. That was the Parsons children.
Yeah, they did that in the Soviet Union too.
Yeah, it's getting to the point where we're afraid of our own children. They could report us, and we could lose our job. My mummy is an anti-vaxxer. My mummy, gave money to the trucker convoy. My daddy. Here. Yeah, my daddy, anyhow, it's just, So, but it's been a pleasure for me, Al. You're a really wonderful man. You ask great questions, and I'm going to email you. And if you ever think of it, when you put this out, my Twitter handle, which if you want to make mention and put that on, that would be useful, because that's where if people want to find out more about me, that's my profile, is where
Yep, I'll put it in the comments. I'll link your Twitter. Follow him on Twitter. Yeah, and I just want to say one last thing. This is about the broader reconciliation movement. I think the reconciliation movement, like, what does it mean? It means to reconcile, right? Oh, with the white man and the Indigenous. But I think it's the exact opposite. It's meant to make sure that true reconciliation never happens. That's the goal of this movement.
Well, it absolutely is. And the evidence is in this. Canada is becoming more divided than ever. And more spoils are going to a part of the population based on race. And it's been taken away from contributing members of the society, taxpayers, based on race. This is not better. This is worse for Canada.
Well, no, that's I really enjoyed this talk. This talk has been very enjoyable. It's like I've learned so much, and it was a pleasure talking with you and talking with you earlier today. And yeah, we will definitely stay in touch. And yeah, there's a lot of good stuff on residential schools, like true stuff, not like fake stuff, like the mass graves. And there's actually some good stuff about this, but yeah, you're not going to find it in the mainstream media. I noticed you had retweeted Lauren Southern, who did a pretty good documentary. She's done a couple on this whole mass grave thing.
Yes, I can mention three names, three really remarkable people, different networks. So Lauren Southern, which is on her own platform, she's amazing, and she has 500,000 followers, so she has influence. And she tried to speak at UBC, invited to speak at UBC a couple of years back, and she wasn't allowed to. It's just absolutely outrageous. Then you have Rebel News, people like Drea Humphrey, who has also done an amazing documentary on the Kamloops story. And then you have a third person done the same thing. Is you have Candace, I think her last name is escaping right now. Candace at True North. So it's wonderful. There are, the main media is completely they're not burying their sand. They're burying all their readers' heads in the sand. They're purposely misleading and omitting and preventing people from having a wide range of information on a lot of important issues in Canada. It's absolutely shameful. But on the other hand, it's allowing independent people, independent platforms, and people like you and me we're being given a voice. We're being given viewership because people know that they're not going to get it reading the Globe and Mail or Toronto Star or listening to CBC or CTV.
Amen. All right. Have you got any last words? Then I'll
No, I just think you're a wonderful man, and I'm very appreciative of you. And I'm going to send you the orange shirt stuff.
Oh, I look forward to reading that. And I've got a friend who is into the same kind of stuff that we talked about today. I'll send it. I'll send this talk to him and anything that I got. Yeah.
And if he wants to reach out to me, I'd be delighted.
Oh, wonderful. All right. So yeah, follow Jim McMurtry on Twitter, and have a good day and God bless.
God bless you, and thank you again.